It's a whole new year of growth, possibilities, and praying that D&D 2024 won't be a complete disaster, and that it'll be released into the Creative Commons. Got my eye on you, Kyle Brink. And with a new year comes fresh goals and aspirations. Meaning, if you're a game master, like me, it comes with thoughts on how you can improve your TTRPG sessions. That's what we're looking at today, using a holistic lens to improve our TTRPG games. Hi, I'm John, and this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today, we're looking at holistic designs in TTRPGs. Let's get into it. I want you to imagine the perfect TTRPG session. Are you a player or a game master? Is there music playing, or is that a distraction? Are there detailed maps and minis, or is everything theater of the mind? Who are you playing with? Are you playing with close friends, and is the tone a little more silly? Or would you rather play with people, even strangers, that are committed to a more dramatic, character-driven story? Everyone has their own vision of a perfect TTRPG session, and there can be a lot of tension created at a table with two individuals that have different expectations and preferences. However, as the game master, the clearer that your vision is for the game you want to run, and the better you can communicate that to your players, the higher the likelihood that you're going to be running a game that everyone can appreciate. Before we move on, I do want to disclaim that the majority of today's topic is for game masters that have a decent amount of experience. If you're a newer GM, or even someone who's considering GMing, I recommend first watching the 7 baby steps to masterful GMing. Game masters have to wear a lot of different hats, and there are a lot of different lenses to look at the job through. If you're still getting your feet wet and trying to figure out what rules to use when, or even how to simply improvise when your players go right when you expected them to go left, adding in a lot of the design elements that we're talking about can potentially be overwhelming. And especially mechanical changes can be a lot for the players of your game to process. If you have watched that video and you're familiar with the 7 baby steps, we're trying to figure out how to fine-tune our approach to bring our games from being great to excellent. Holistic design is looking at everything that goes into the outcome of a game, whether it's part of the game's design or the design that surrounds the game. For example, obviously your skill as a GM and the rule set you're playing by are going to factor into how enjoyable the experience is. But there are several peripheral factors that also influence that outcome. When are you playing, and for how long? If you want a deep, character-driven story, starting your session at 8 p.m. after everybody is tired from work may not help actualize that goal. Likewise, if everyone is just looking for something silly and fun, needing a 12-hour marathon of a session may be too much. All of these considerations are what I call peripheral systems. Systems that aren't part of the game's core rules, but nonetheless affect how enjoyable an experience is. Even if you're not interested yet in tuning a system or adding a lot of the elements we'll talk about later, considering these simple peripheral systems is an easy way to experiment with what structure is going to best match your individual table. Here's some examples of questions I ask when I'm organizing a game, and some of the experiences I've had. When are you playing? In my experience, the best games are when everyone involved has the same day off, and we start somewhere in the mid-afternoon and usually end by 8 or 9 p.m. Everyone starts fresh and ready to go, and we end slightly before people start getting drained. That being said, one of the earliest campaigns I ran had the explicit function of letting the players blow off steam after work. Starting at 6:30 p.m. on a Monday and playing for 2 hours was just the right amount of time to help them fight some monsters in combat, kick down some doors, and play with some different mechanics that they might not be understanding in their other campaigns. Now, you may already be protesting. Scheduling is the big bad final enemy of D&D. I can only get my players together for some certain time. If so, just recognize that that may be an element that's preventing you from running an in-depth character-driven story, and that there are other things that you'll need to consider in order to achieve that goal, or that goal needs to be changed entirely. For example, that session I just mentioned started off as the players blowing off steam and learning some elements of the game, but eventually morphed into a deep, emotional narrative. Another question I ask is, how long are we planning to play? I found that for my narrative-heavy, character-driven games, the sweet spot is 5 to 6 hours with 10-minute breaks every 90 minutes. That being said, I play a more light-hearted, silly game with my grandma about once a month. Sometimes we get through sessions within 90 minutes. It's just enough gameplay that everyone has some light fun, but not so long that everyone's tired by the end. One campaign that I was a player in frequently had 10 to 12 hour long sessions. And for me, that was a bit too long. Somewhere around hour 9, I was experiencing diminishing returns. And also, that's usually when the big final showdown would start. We'd enter into complex combats, which arguably required the most brain power and processing. But because I was so burnt out because I was playing for so long, it was hard to enjoy them. I was also part of a table where the DM wanted a character-driven narrative, but because we only had 2 hours, I always felt like I didn't have enough time to warm up into my character before the session was over. This would be a great time for me to include that I'm not trying to say you should play like me or you're doing it wrong somehow. Rather, by experimenting with different session lengths, you can observe what your particular table enjoys. Just because I like a good 5 to 6 hour session may not mean your table does. They might get burnt out after 90 minutes or 2 hours. Likewise, you may have a table that really wants to just commit to this one thing for an entire day. In which case, go for it. Another thing to consider is how frequently are you playing? The most common answer I see to this question is weekly. In my experience, at tables with weekly sessions, eventually the table burned out, some quicker than others. I find the most fulfilling frequency 2 longer games a month. Some groups really need that weekly meeting time. It gives them something to look forward to during a hard week of work. And one last suggestion I heard from a different YouTube creator is try 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Meaning that you have a weekly game for 3 weeks in a row, but the 4th week everyone takes off. And this also allows for specific events that come up, like, dance recitals, end of the year concerts, and holidays. And what space are we playing in? I've played TTRPGs in a variety of environments. Beyond my personal preference, which is online through a VTT, I've played in cafes, a friend's kitchen, my living room, classrooms, a crowded lobby. Your physical space that you're playing in has a huge effect on how enjoyable a game is. For example, if I'm playing in a busy cafe, I'm going to be watching my language and being very careful about how I describe things so I don't disturb any of the people around me or say something inappropriate in case there's a kid nearby. Likewise, I find my living room way too cramped to play a good TTRPG in. It's an uncomfortable physical setup, which makes it hard to enjoy the thing that we all sat down to play. Again, there are other groups that find online play really alienating. They have a harder time feeling the same human connection than they do if they were all playing in the same in-person space. Again, these are just questions that I ask myself, and I found individual players have different preferences, and so the point is to tune in to the settings that will allow you to run your ideal session. Think of it like a radio knob. Sometimes you tune it too far in one direction or the other, but the closer you get to the channel you want, the clearer the music comes through. And even if you have it perfectly tuned, sometimes weather systems or some outside factor may still leave a little bit of static. Even group to group, your answers to these questions may change. It's not about finding a right answer, it's just learning how to ask insightful questions. Now, while I actually think peripheral systems are something that you can figure out no matter where you're at on your GMing journey, when it comes to the actual design and game mastering implementation of a game, that you really need a little more experience for. For this part of our holistic design conversation, I'm going to be using a tool described by Jesse Schell in his book, The Art of Game Design, that he calls the Elemental Tetrad. These are the 4 elements of a game's design that, when harmonized together, create an awesome experience. And the 4 elements are mechanics, story, aesthetics, and technology. Let's start with mechanics, which according to Schell is what makes a game a game. Mechanics are the procedures, rules, goal, and what a player can and cannot do in order to get that goal. A lot of it comes down to the choices that a player has. Now, one of the qualities that make TTRPGs unique from other games is that really the goal a lot of times isn't clear. Whereas in a lot of sports, the goal is to get more points than another team, or the goal of a lot of board games is to make it to the end faster than any other players. For a TTRPG, the goal is kind of this amorphous thing that needs to be agreed upon by the entire table. Are we trying to tell a compelling story? Or are we trying to complete a quest that's given to us by the GM? Do we want to exercise our imagination or reasoning skills? Or do we want some kind of meaningful catharsis? Now, you can't measure meaningful catharsis, but you can observe how you and your players respond to various elements of a game's story. That being said, mechanics are concrete values that directly relate to a player's emotional response and how they experience the game. For example, in your TTRPG, do you track ammunition? For some games, you really don't need to. Let's even use 5th edition D&D as an example. If your sessions are like a lot of sessions I participated in, there's some kind of setup, there's a story, and a big fight at the end, you probably won't go through all 20 pieces of ammunition in that one fight before you return to town. In which case, in those games, you probably don't need to track ammunition. However, if you're playing a 30-room dungeon crawl, ammunition is one of those various resource pools you need to keep track of. Now in 5th edition, there are rules for ammunition. What we're talking about is whether you ignore those rules or honor them. We're not even talking about changing the rules with either variants or homebrew. For example, in my 5e games, I use variant encumbrance with a little extra. I really don't like the idea that a character could be wandering around and have 17 halberds in their back pocket. Unlike Skyrim, I want characters to describe how they're carrying all this stuff. And a lot of times what this does is it gets players to make interesting choices. Is this a piece of equipment that's worth lugging around? Do I take a 2-handed halberd with a hand crossbow as a backup ranged weapon? Or am I an archer that has a bigger longbow but a little dagger as a backup melee weapon? Although this does have mechanical impacts, it has story impacts too. After all, combats change when players have a different amount of choices to make in terms of weapons they have access to. And it also gets them to think about their character's description in a different way. Speaking of story, which is our second element, Schell describes story as being the sequence of events that unfolds in your game. I have had a plethora of conversations about what story in games mean, and let me tell you, this can branch off in a lot of wild and weird directions. So we're going to be talking about the conventional idea of story in TTRPGs. Things like the setting, the characters, the plots, and the conflicts. Now, kind of like when I was describing the game goal, these can be squishier things. There are entire lectures and essays on the literary devices revolving around these things. So really, when you're looking at your game's design, some things to think about for story are, is it understandable? Are your players engaged with it? Are your players excited to see where the story goes? Do they like the elements you included as the GM, like NPCs and world building? Or are they more interested in their character's development or the development of the other player characters? Again, it's not about having an answer, it's about learning how to ask insightful questions. I've played at tables where the players aren't really concerned about the emotional development of their characters. They love diving into the world's lore and becoming friends with the various NPCs. A lot of tables I GM for, they don't care what world details I present. They're interested in seeing the evolution of the party's dynamics and the friendships between player characters. Some tables like a lot of detail in world building. Some tables get annoyed by it. So how are you structuring your stories, and what's the level of detail that you're adding, and how do your players respond to it? Tied but a little separate to this is your game's aesthetic. This is more the game's sensory design. As Shell puts it, how does the game look, sound, smell, taste, and feel? Now, obviously, as GMs, we can describe those things with our words, but this is where something like music can come into play. One of my players commented that what they really like about games that I run is I have a fairly limited selection of music that I've prepared, but it triggers certain Pavlovian responses in my players. For example, I play the jazz remix of Tifa's theme from Final Fantasy VII Remake to open my sessions with a little bit of inter-party social interaction. And as soon as the players hear that, they know it's time to focus, and they also know that they're in a safe place. Sometimes I'll use some tracks from The Witcher 3, especially ones with like a spooky vibe, to let the players know to be on alert, to be on guard. These musical cues help my players get into the right headspace so they know what kind of decisions they want to be making. In the same way, I really like showing my players artwork of the NPCs they're talking to, even if it's concept art I found through some Google image search. This is also why I like GMing with a laptop, even in person, because rather than spending money on ink printing all this stuff out, I can just open up the image and turn the laptop around to show them who they're talking to. And also, play the music I've prepared from the same device. Which brings me to technology. In its simplest definition, these are the materials that are required to play the game. And for TTRPGs, you don't really need a lot. Maybe some paper, some pencils, physical dice, but even then there are a lot of digital tools that different TTRPGs use. For D&D, there's D&D Beyond, or digital character sheets in a VTT. But again, how does the technology either enforce the focus that you want or interrupt it? For example, for me, I found that having my D&D Beyond character sheet on my phone was a distraction. So even when I play online, I make sure to use physical paper and pencil. But when I play online, I use online die rollers. This is really just me, but whenever I'd roll a D20 just kind of here on my own, and I'd get a nat 20, I'd feel a twinge of guilt of like, are the people on the other side of the screen questioning whether or not it was an actual nat 20? It's a really silly concern, but I always felt better showing my work, whether I was a GM or a player, to be like, nope, this is what I rolled in the open. You can see all my work for itself. And then if I happen to get a nat 20, yay! But I'm trying to remove any sort of doubt whether the roll was legitimate or not. Obviously, for other players, they'll love rolling physical dice. It doesn't bother them. And at my table that I run through a VTT, we have a mix of players that use the digital dice versus physical ones. The Elemental Tetrad and the Peripheral Systems are tools that you have to look at your game and see how all the moving parts are harmonizing or not. I'm not claiming this is a comprehensive list. If there's something that you've done for your games that I haven't mentioned that have made a big difference, please let me know in the comments down below. The whole point of holistic design is seeing how all of the different factors work together to create the outcome that you're getting. And if you're not getting the outcome you want, what's something you can do to nudge your game in the correct direction? Sometimes your group has lost interest because you're playing too often. Maybe you're playing too late at night and they're already burned out from work. Or maybe D&D is the one thing they look forward to each week, so you need a weekly game to keep it going. As we go into 2024, I recommend looking at the goals you have for the coming year through a similar lens. Rather than just trying harder and then burning out before February, what are the little changes that you can make in the design of your day that will allow you to nudge toward the place you want to go? After all, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I'll tell you right now, little things that make a huge difference are to drink a little less soda, drink a lot more water, and go to bed just a little bit earlier. It is amazing at how big of a role sleep plays into the enjoyability of your day. So now I want to hear what all of you have to say. What are some holistic design decisions you've made that have made your game much more successful? What are your goals for 2024, both GMing wise and personally? Have an awesome day, everybody. Have a happy new year. And remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.